Hello, I'm Roger Watson and I'm very proud to be speaking to you today in my capacity as one of the academic deans of nursing. Clearly I'm based in the UK at the moment for obvious reasons. Once travel restrictions are lifted, I hope to be visiting at least once a year. I was just checking my records and I've had a 10-year association since 2012 with South West Medical University, and I greatly look forward to coming back someday. In this session I've been asked to talk about how to be a good supervisor, and I've been told that this will apply to being a supervisor of doctoral, masters and undergraduate students if they're engaged in research projects. I'm mainly experienced in working with doctoral students, and most of what I'm going to say comes from that perspective, but can equally easily be applied to master's students and to undergraduate students and to any student who's undertaking a research project. In preparation for this session, I found a framework online from 2019 published by Professor Stan Taylor of the UK Council for Graduate Education, called Good Supervisory Practice, a framework. And I've largely based what I'm going to say on this, with some material of my own added and also some reflections from my own experience. I can share this document with anybody who wants it as a PDF. I'll give you my contact details at the end of the session. From the framework, the criteria for good supervisory practice, I've chosen some of the areas covered there, and I'm going to go through these in some detail, reflecting on the framework and also reflecting on my own practice and my own experience. The first area I want to look at is recruitment and selection. It's very important that we have mechanisms in place to select the appropriate candidates, ones who are appropriately qualified, as far as we can tell, appropriately motivated, and can work independently on research at the level we expect, whether it's doctoral, masters or undergraduate. We need to develop appropriate supervisory relationships with candidates and also with any co-supervisors. Both of these sets of relationships are crucial to success. It's quite common for doctoral students to have a committee of several supervisors, and they need to work well together. We need, of course, to support the candidates' research projects. We need to have sufficient expertise and experience ourselves to do that, to see them through the project. It's not just about supporting the candidate personally. We should, and this is very important, throughout the project, encourage candidates to write, and we should give appropriate feedback. Don't leave the writing all until the end of the project, especially with a large project like a PhD. Students ought to be writing throughout, and also, of course, as I'll mention, beyond the project into publishing their work. It's very important that we keep the research on track and monitor progress. We should also support the candidate's personal, professional and career development. We should do this appropriately. When it says personal development, it doesn't necessarily mean that we should form a personal relationship with the candidate. We're not friends, we're supervisors, but we do need to attend to any aspects of their development that we think that we can help with. We should, of course, support the candidates through the completion of the final examination, whatever format that takes, whether it's written or whether it's a face-to-face oral examination, however it's done. We need to prepare the candidates for that. Then we need to support the candidates to disseminate their research by whatever means is appropriate, whether it's published or in conference presentations or a combination of both, or by any other means that they can share their research findings with others. Not just for the sake of sharing the findings, but also to gain the appropriate experience in doing so. And finally, as supervisors, we should be reflecting on and enhancing our own practice. This may necessitate your institution to set up a mechanism whereby at least annually supervisors can get together and reflect on how well they've supervised what's gone well and what's gone wrong. And also it may be appropriate, once a body of experience is built up, that some kind of training for supervisors, especially new supervisors, is provided. First, I will take a look at recruitment and selection. And there are several aspects to this, not only the candidate, but the feasibility of their project. Supervisors can be involved, and indeed should be involved, in recruitment activities in several ways. And one of the best ways they can do this is to publicise the areas under which they can offer supervision. We do need to be careful that we don't end up supervising people who are not at all within our area of expertise, and certainly not at all within our area of interest. We should be interested in the projects and able to offer very specific methodological advice, for example. We can also work with candidates who are interested in working with us to develop their proposals before we become supervisors. So we may need to provide some service before students come to the university or come from their classes to work with you as a supervisor. So we should probably not just wait until applications come in, but we should be trying to find students who are interested in working with us and helping them to develop their proposal, which may then go to another committee to be approved and for it to be allocated to you. But it really helps a great deal if you've been involved in helping the student to design their project. You also get to know the student, you get to know the project, you get to know a little bit about the qualities and perhaps even the limitations of the potential candidate. So the message there is that we should be involved in the recruitment process. It should not just be left up to other people. There's nothing worse than simply being allocated a student for whom you are not a suitable supervisor. We should attend to the feasibility of the project. It's not uncommon for students to come with projects which are not feasible, mainly because they are too big. For example, someone may come with a year available to do a project and propose to do a randomized controlled trial. That simply isn't possible. I can assure you that it's almost impossible to do a properly conducted randomized controlled trial, even within the 3 or so years available to a PhD student. I'm not saying that these should never be done, but I'm just saying that we need to be sure it can be done. So make sure that the project is feasible. First of all, can it be done? Students often actually don't have any idea of whether their project is feasible or not. And they very often come with ideas which are completely impossible to achieve. They would never be finished in the time, and even methodologically, they just can't be done. So you must check from your own experience and looking across at previous students perhaps that you've supervised, or seeking some advice from colleagues. Can it be done? Can it be done in time? And indeed, can it be done at all? Is the science sound? Is it designed appropriately? And are the methods likely to attain the end that they want? Are there any ethical problems which may prevent them from doing it? If a project is beautifully designed but doesn't get through an ethical committee, it won't be done and shouldn't be done. So you need to make sure that projects are ethical. And finally, how likely is it that the student, or even you working with the student, will have access to the participants? Sometimes they may be looking to have too many participants and will not be able to find them locally, for example, within the time frame of the project. or there may simply not be enough people with the kind of condition that they want to look at, or it may just be very, very difficult to attain access to certain kinds of potential participants. Hospital patients are relatively easy, but once we move out of hospital into the community, and especially working, for example, with children or anyone vulnerable, or anybody in minority groups, very small groups of people, it may be difficult to gain access. So you need to balance all of these things. It doesn't mean to say that a project has to be abandoned if you think it cannot be done. The project may well need to be adjusted in some way in order that it can be done. And this is why it's important for the supervisors to be working with the potential candidates throughout the selection process. You may then want to have a look with the student at the relevance of the project. Is it a project that's likely to fulfill their needs, both as an individual and for the sake of completing the project? Does it solve their problems? Does it resonate with them? Is it something that they are interested in? In fact, is it something that you're interested in? And how close does it take them to their goals? Does it give them new hopes and indeed new experience and new qualifications and new skills? Are they curious about it, or is it simply something that they've been told to do? Anyway, there are various things about the relevance of the project, and mainly they should be relevant to the student and to some extent to the supervisor. If they're not, the project is likely to flounder and not be done. So basically, is it related to the student's interests? What about the implications of the project? What might the results mean? Will they be useful? We need to be aware that some projects don't work as such. For example, you may not be able to achieve the aims. You may carry out an experimental piece of work and it doesn't show that what you've been developing is any better than something that you've been testing it against, for example. But of course, you should think of this, you should be thinking ahead and having contingency plans and plans that will take into account difficulties in the project. So if you think the project may not work, but the student is determined to go ahead with it, then you need to think, well, if that doesn't work, if the recruitment strategy doesn't work, then how else could we mitigate that? How could we complete the project, even if we don't get the right number of participants? That's a very common problem in research projects with students. And finally, as a supervisor, we have to be a little bit selfish and ask, what is in it for you? Is this something that interests you? Is it something that might lead to a publication with the student? Is it something that will give you the right experience, or something that will lead to a program of work? You do need to think what's in it for you. It is possible to supervise projects which are not particularly going to benefit you, but if it does benefit you in some way, it certainly makes you more interested in it. And this is all to do with matching up the right supervisors with the right students. Do be aware of the methodology versus the topic problem that often arises with students. Students may not find a problem, they may actually come with a method. So find a problem and then a method that will suit it. Don't entertain students, or at least disabuse students of any notions when they come to say things like, I want to do a grounded theory study, or I want to do a randomized controlled trial, regardless of whether they have a problem that can be solved using those methods. So do make sure that the student has a worthwhile problem to investigate, and indeed has a worthwhile research project. Don't be driven by methods. And of course, you may find out that a problem can be investigated in several ways, and the student may have to change their mind about the kind of methodology that they want to use to investigate that. So beware of methodology versus topic. Be driven by the problem and not by the method. Next, I want to turn to supervisory relationships with candidates. Haven't got a huge amount to say here, but I do have one or two things. And it's crucial that right from the start for supervisors and doctoral candidates or any other kind of candidate to have a clear expectation of each other. And the first task is to discuss these and to negotiate how they're going to be met. So early in the project, you need to be clear as a supervisor with the student what it is that you can provide for them. And it's also very important to set down, for example, ground rules about how you're going to meet these, for example, meeting once every month, and how available you might be at other times. And also for you to be clear what you expect from the student. I'll come back to this a little bit later when I look at keeping the project on track. Beware that students and supervisors may have different goals. This doesn't mean to say that the project can't go ahead or the supervisory relationship can't go ahead and the project can't be achieved, but do be aware that students come with great aspirations to do a research project, to get published, to gain, for example, a PhD, to gain the title of doctor, for example. And as a supervisor, you may simply be looking to have a problem solved by the student. So sometimes there can be some disparity between what you want and what the student wants. So it doesn't mean to say that you can't go ahead if you've got different goals, but I do think that you need to be able somehow, especially as a supervisor, to have empathy with the student and to see what it is that they want. And it might not be exactly the same as what you want. Do make sure that as a supervisor you don't become a surrogate parent. You're not a friend and you're not a partner to them. And of course, if there's any inappropriate relationship, for example, develops, a romantic relationship, for example, and this is not unknown, then the supervisory relationship would probably have to cease and alternative arrangements would have to be found. So you're not mummy and daddy to the student, you are a supervisor, to some extent a colleague. So just be very aware of that and make sure that students know that. If students need a lot of personal help or even medical advice, despite the fact that we are nurses and doctors, I think they should be sent to the appropriate support services or to see a medical practitioner. Do not try to do the job that other people might do. This doesn't mean to say that you have to be distant and remote and unfriendly. It just means to say that you have to be professional. And in terms, to some extent, of keeping the project on track, I think with reference to what I said about establishing ground rules, I think it's very important to establish with students that you cannot read 5,000 words while they sit there and watch you. So if you're going to set ground rules for writing, for example, a chapter of a PhD, which may easily be 5,000 words, you have to set clear goals about when this is expected and how far in advance of any meeting you would expect to see it. Do not, under any circumstances, entertain students turning up unexpectedly with work which they expect you to read there and then. That is not good academic practice, it's not good of them, and it's not good for them. And you do need to try and develop good habits in the student and not work in such a way yourself that it encourages bad habits. So this is partly to do with keeping the project on track, which I will come to later, but that's mostly about keeping records, really. But I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Next, and only very briefly, I want to talk about supervisory relationships with co-supervisors, it goes without saying that these need to be good. You don't need to be friends with your supervisors either, you just need to work well with them, and you have to realize that what you're doing is working for the benefit of the student. It's not a competition between the supervisors to see who's best or who is most popular. It's how you can work together and use your skills, your complementary skills, to help the student. So it can be problematic. Having more than one supervisor can lead to disagreements or even divergence, and it can leave the candidate trying to sort of navigate those perspectives or advice. They may get contradictory advice and they may be confused. It's your job as a supervisory team to make sure that the advice is, if not exactly the same, at least there's an agreement about what the student has to do. And encourage students to speak to both supervisors, or more than two supervisors, but it's common certainly in my own system to have two supervisors. Students shouldn't be going exclusively to one and not to the other, and they should keep either supervisor involved and informed if they've consulted the other supervisor about something. So encourage good, we would call it collegial practice. It's just good professional practice to keep everyone in the team involved in decisions that you've made. So try to encourage the students to speak to both supervisors, and also try strongly to discourage students from taking advice from people outside of the supervisory team without letting you know. It doesn't mean to say that they can't take advice, but they shouldn't take it without you knowing. There's nothing worse as a supervisor, and nothing more annoying, to be frank, than a student telling you that they spoke to someone who said that that wasn't the way to do something, or the way you advised wasn't to do something. They should have told you that they were going to speak to that person and that they would come back to discuss it with you. So do try to encourage good practice by students in being transparent and open with you if they are consulting anyone else. In fact, strictly speaking, they should ask your permission before they do it. Next, and very, very briefly, supporting the candidate's research projects. I don't have a great deal to say about this. There isn't a great deal to say about this, despite the fact that it's a major part of the activity that you will be doing. But of course, supporting research projects as an academic is something that you do anyway. The methods should be things that are commonly used by you, and it should be second nature to you. So actually supporting the research, while it's a major part of the time that you will spend with the student, should not be a major part of the difficulty of the supervisory relationship, especially not if you've designed a good project with the student and you're clear about what to do if anything goes wrong. So just beware that new doctoral candidates, even doctoral candidates, but masters and especially undergraduate students, will have probably no experience of research and really will not have much idea of what they're letting themselves in for. Some PhD students come to a PhD without any idea of what the actual PhD is and what the extent of the work that's involved, and often they do not realize the extent to which they will be expected to work independently. So you may need to give them some kind of induction into research, or the nature of research, what the key concepts are and what it involves and what good practice is. Now, increasingly in British universities, just want to share this with you, this is no longer really the responsibility of the supervisor. The supervisor may well be involved day to day in the project, but in terms of preparing students for undertaking independent research, that's usually a function of the university, and the university, or a unit within the university, will put on programs for students every year so that they can learn about good research practice. But you as a supervisor, of course, do need to make sure that they attend those courses, and also that in their projects they do actually apply what they have learned. So if you're aware that once they're down what we call the slipway, once the project has begun, it's almost inevitable that they will encounter problems, and it's important that you're there to lend help and support. There is never a PhD project, or in fact any kind of research project, that doesn't encounter problems. Students must be encouraged to come and tell you about this as soon as they possibly can, and not to allow problems to last too long without being resolved. Likewise, if they have problems in their personal life or their medical history, they should also tell you about this if it is going to affect the progress of the project and the progress of their PhD. They do not have to tell you what the problems are, they do not have to tell you what the medical issues are, but they do need to tell you that there is a problem that may affect their project. And depending on the rules and regulations of the university, you may have to even take extreme action, like stopping the clock or suspending the students' studies for a short time until they've resolved particularly their personal or their medical problems. So my main point from this is that students should be encouraged to come and share problems with you. You should be training them to expect that there will be difficulties, and you should be expecting to help them when there are. We do need to encourage candidates to write, and we do need to give them appropriate feedback on that writing. There's no point in students writing unless we can tell them what's good about it and what's not so good about it, and offer them advice to improve it. So there will be a very large part of a PhD student's time in particular, but to some extent a master's student or an undergraduate student, there will be a very large amount of time spent on writing. And that all, to some extent, will be about writing their thesis or their dissertation. Even if they're writing right at the beginning of the project, that writing should be relevant to their thesis. So we need to be clear with the students that they are to produce written work throughout their studies. They need to be able to explain or articulate what they're thinking, reflect on their findings, and to gain feedback. That's part of the academic and indeed the scientific progress. They need to be getting used to that as early as possible. And students, of course, may be reluctant to write, and we do need to be quite insistent and set targets, and also give them strong encouragement in their writing. So if they're unable to write substantial amounts, give them small targets and more frequent deadlines. If they're as they develop more independence, they can be left for longer periods. But if they don't develop the habit of writing and they're unable to write appropriately, you have to make it quite clear to them that they will not complete their studies. So this is very, very important. Of course, all of these people undertaking research at any level, doctoral, master's or undergraduate, will already be students and will be used to writing. They'll have written essays, they'll have written at school. But the extent, the sheer size of a PhD or a master's dissertation and the depth to which things have to be explained will be completely new to them and very challenging. And once we have received some work, it's very important that we give them feedback, and it should be high quality feedback. In other words, it should be quite detailed. If the writing is good, you don't need to make many comments. Don't look to make comments just for the sake of it. As the writing improves, you will make fewer comments, but at the beginning you may have to make very specific comments, including tracking in changes or writing comments in the margin of the writing of the work they've submitted. And of course the Word package allows us to do this. So we do need to give very specific feedback, and it can be everything from proofreading to correcting grammar to moving parts of the work around and to helping them to express themselves properly. Some students, of course, will be better writers than others, and some will be poor, but I emphasize that they all have to meet the same standard at the end, particularly if they're doing a PhD project. Now, we do need to keep the research on track, and we need to monitor progress. And I've spoken to some extent about this already. We do need to be seeing written work from the students, and we do need to set them targets for this and to expect to have that work in ahead of the dates when you're going to meet the student. However, we do also need to keep records, and again, reflecting on the system in my own country, these are becoming increasingly formal, and it's always a good idea to have a system of record keeping. If anything goes wrong in the supervisory relationship, this is the only thing that will protect you. You need to be able to prove that you met the student, that you asked them for work, and that you gave them appropriate feedback, and that if there were problems, they were noticed early. So have some kind of system for records and periodic reviews of progress. This may well be imposed on you by your institution. It certainly is in the United Kingdom. If not, you need to keep your own system. Make sure you use it. So if you have a system, a record sheet, for example, for meetings, or if you have a system whereby you email the student after the meeting with your feedback, or they email you with work, that you actually file that away and keep it until they have completed their PhD. So file it, make sure you can find this work easily. It's good to create a separate file on your computer for each PhD student, to have every year separated out, and then within that year to have different folders within that, for example, for written work, for meetings, and for any other aspects of the project that you've been working on. And finally, you should refer to it. Every meeting should begin by referring back to what was achieved or not achieved in the previous meeting and what goals were set. And of course, the record keeping should also involve goal setting and should record those goals and record the extent to which they've been met. As I've said, we do need to support candidates personally and obviously professionally and in terms of career development. By personally, I've made it clear I don't mean to become the student's friend or a surrogate parent for them, but we do need to make sure that personally they are developing, but particularly professionally and career-wise. So doctoral candidates have what we call ups and downs in their personal lives. We need to be aware of these, and it's very important that we help people to seek appropriate professional services. We should not be trying to solve these problems for them ourselves. That is an intrusion both by the student into your supervision and by you into their lives. But you also need to recognize that you are a role model for them. They'll be looking to you to see how do you manage. You may be married with children and busy, and they may be single, or what, they may not be in that position, but may be finding it very hard to complete their work and to keep a personal life. I think we do need to show them that it's possible to have a personal life even if you are very, very busy. So the students should be encouraged not to make the PhD project everything in their life. They should maintain their own interests. But again, we shouldn't be specifying what these are. We should be simply acting as a good role model. I emphasize again, we should not become personally involved with the students. And of course, we also have a responsibility beyond that, professionally and career development. So anything that we can help them to develop professionally, we should do, particularly in the nursing and medical field. There's a great deal to develop professionally there. Make sure that they're attending the right conferences, or if they need to keep up their practice, that they can do that in some way that doesn't interfere with the project too much. And if they want to be academics, is it possible for them to do some supervision of other students, or to do some teaching by themselves? Whatever opportunities will help them to develop. We must be careful not to exploit students, of course, and we should be careful always that it doesn't distract them from their project in terms of time or effort. Now, all PhDs, all systems, all levels of degree, doctoral, masters, or undergraduate, they all have some kind of assessment at the end or an examination. And I will refer almost solely here to PhD examinations. And PhD examinations, certainly within my system, are usually done face-to-face in what's called a viva or an oral. And these can be quite intimidating. And it's not clear, the evidence is very unclear as to whether we should be putting students through mock vivas. So, you know, this is meant to be amusing, you know, but we shouldn't be we shouldn't be trying to frighten the students about their final examination. It should not be shouldn't be an interrogation. It should be a conversation. So we need to explain to students, if they're going to do a PhD type oral examination, what it is that they will expect in it. That they will be asked to give a summary of their work, that they will be asked specific questions about each aspect of their work. If they've written a large dissertation, that they will be taken through it probably from beginning to end. Some of the questions may be challenging, but they've got to be aware that as far as their work is concerned, that in fact they are the expert, and many of the questions that they may be asked are genuine questions whereby the examiners have misunderstood or don't understand anything. So the message from that is, please don't try to make the final examination something that terrifies the student. Talk to them often about it, and if they want to go through a pretend or a mock viva, then that's okay. You may want to do that. As I say, there's not a great deal of evidence that that helps students. It's just much better for them to be aware of what to expect. And of course, there will be other students going through examinations. Encourage them to speak to them. There is some publication on this for supervisors in Nurse Education Today, an article by Cleary, Horsfall and Hunt on tips for PhD thesis examination for clinicians, researchers and for novices. This is aimed at academics. Again, if you wanted that article, you just have to ask me for it. I can send it to you, or you may well be able to find it through your own library. But students need to be clear as to what a thesis is, and sometimes they're not clear. So they need to be clear about what the expectations are in terms of the size and the depth. And of course, one of the best ways to do this is to show them previous dissertations, either that you have supervised or that have been supervised and shelved on the libraries of your university. Increasingly, of course, they will not be shelved, they will be available online. But do encourage students to find theses that are similar to theirs as early as they possibly can, and to be looking at if not the contents and depth, at least at the structure and the level of detail that's required. Is there a handbook for detailed guidance? Is this published by your institution? If so, then you should be aware of this, and the student should have it too. It should be to hand every time a student asks a question, and it may be you that has it to hand, or it should be available online, for example, for students to consult. Make sure that you know where this guidance is available and point your students towards it. And of course, do you have examples, as I've said already, of excellent theses and dissertations? Do you keep these available? Do you mark them as being of particular merit? That might also be helpful for the students. Once the projects are finished, or even if the students have worked particularly hard, we may be able to support candidates to disseminate the research during the project, but we should be paying attention to this at the end. So supporting candidates to disseminate their research, we need to set expectations at the start of the candidacy. We should make it clear to students that they will be expected to disseminate their work. Of course, in some universities it's compulsory to do this, but even if it's not, we should make it clear to them that this is an expectation. We should, model the process of publication. We should be encouraging them to write in such a way that everything is potentially written for publication. We should be telling them about academic publications and how to write them. They will be different from their thesis, but they will not be so different. So we need to make sure that they understand what an academic publication is and how to approach it if they haven't previously done so. As I've said already, try to encourage candidates to publish as they go through. Some candidates find this difficult. We must make sure that that doesn't distract from the project, but it's very satisfying for candidates to publish as they go through their work. It's also very good to make that available to the examiners at the end, and it makes it very difficult for them to give them problems if this work has already been reviewed by others and published elsewhere. Make sure that you work with them to establish co-publishing. There's no reason why as a supervisor you should not be a co-author, and indeed you should be there because you should be taking responsibility for the work which you've supervised. But do make sure that you are publishing with them, and that they may even be able to publish with you on some other work that you're doing if it's relevant to their project. And once they've finished, they might disappear and get very busy and go away and do other things. So once they've finished, establish a postdoctoral or a postmaster's publication plan. Be sure with them what it is that they want to publish or that's publishable from their PhD. Set a limit to that. Don't publish too many papers, but be clear on the ones that you're going to do and how you're going to work on them. I don't want to say too much about writing for publication here. I'm happy to come back and talk about that at another time, but there's a lot to be said about that. But you need to make sure that they have a publication plan. You need to assure that you're dealing with intellectual property. It's difficult to have blanket rules about this. Some universities will say that all the work belongs to them. Some say that the work belongs to the student. Some say it's shared. There's no blanket rules about this. You do need to be clear, however. And you do need to be clear that as a supervisor, you're not stealing the ideas of your students or being seen to be doing this. The only rule is to agree early. Make sure that you agree early who's going to be responsible for what and whose work it is. Is the project student-led or supervisor-led? There are differences. Most projects in my field, and certainly in British universities, are probably student-led within social sciences and nursing, but in laboratory work, the work is much more supervisor-led. You need to make sure that you understand which it is. The student should have a stake. In other words, they should be able to get publications from their work, and they should be recognized for their work. And finally, it says there, sort this out early. This cannot be and shouldn't be sorted out retrospectively. It shouldn't be sorted out at the end of the project. What we call the ground rules should be very clear at the beginning. And finally, before I finish, reflecting on and enhancing practice. And in fact, the document that I referred to at the beginning on good supervision practice has quite a lot to say about this, and I'm going to take material from that. If you want to improve your practice, you need to evaluate it, you need to reflect upon it, and you need to see what your own strengths and weaknesses are and build on the former. Make sure that you build to your strengths but address any weaknesses. And when you're a new supervisor, you will certainly have weaknesses and areas of uncertainty. But this is where having more than one supervisor can help. They can often be complementary and compensate for one another. We should undertake professional development to enhance our practice, and if there are workshops or programs available, then we should attend them. Your institution may run these, but it may be the case that research grant bodies and research councils may run them, or they may be available in another university if they're not available in yours. It's always good to undertake some specific training about areas of supervision, and also to share your own views and your own good practice. And where you identify good practice, it's possible, you should disseminate that for the benefit of others. It's quite common in some universities for PhD supervisors to give annual conferences or to provide to write some booklets or pamphlets for members of staff, which are case studies or examples of good practice. So do try to make sure that if you've got good practice in your supervision and you know that something works and that students seem to rate it highly, then do make sure that you find some way of sharing that with others. Now clearly, I've been talking so far about the supervisory process and the relationships that are developed throughout it, and the practices that we need to implement. But ultimately, we must prevent our student from failing the PhD. We must explain to them that if they're serious about this, there are ways that a PhD can be failed, and we want to avoid doing that. And this is taken from somewhere on the internet, and it's 5 ways to fail your PhD, and we should be sure that we're avoiding these, obviously, and we should be telling the students that they need to avoid these pitfalls. First of all is don't talk to your supervisor about who you think should examine your thesis. The supervisor should be having a conversation with the student about who might be a suitable examiner. Clearly, it cannot be somebody who they know or work with closely. They have to be appropriate, but they also need to have appropriate experience and publication in that area of work. And actually, the students often have a better idea of this than the supervisors. Don't send your thesis to someone who's never examined, sending your thesis to someone who's never examined a thesis before, for example. This wouldn't necessarily be the student's responsibility, but do make sure that anybody who's involved in examining a PhD student has the appropriate experience. If they don't have the appropriate experience, they should be teamed up with someone who does. Don't write your introduction first to your thesis. So do not sit down one day and start writing at the beginning of your thesis and working your way through to the end. What you should encourage students to do first is to write up their methodology, because that's what will not change unless something goes very wrong. So they should have the methodology written up as a proposal, and that can be used directly in the PhD. Then they should be looking at their results and possibly their literature review and writing these up. The introduction will be written fully at the end of the process, when you've written the rest of the work and you know what you're introducing. So students, if they start at the beginning of the thesis and write the introduction first, they may well get stuck. Write a bad literature review. Clearly, the literature review for your thesis needs to be very, very good. It needs to have no gaps in it that the examiners can identify. So you need to pay a great deal of attention to the literature review aspect of your thesis. This is what you need to tell your students. And this should, of course, these days be written up to PRISMA type standards. Even if it's not a meta-analysis, it needs to be written as rigorously as possible. And the supervisors can have a great deal of input here, and the students should, if possible, undertake some proper training by their librarians on systematic reviewing. And finally, not letting anyone else do your copy editing. What you should be encouraging students to do is let other people see their work. It's almost impossible to copy edit your own work, especially extensive work. Mistakes always creep in. So what I'm saying here is do encourage them to let others copy edit the work, perhaps even a professional. So going through these again more positively, the first point means, the students should talk to their supervisors about potential examiners. The thesis should be sent to someone with reasonable experience. You shouldn't write your introduction first, you should leave that until the end. You should pay attention to doing an excellent literature review, and that can be updated throughout the work, and you should at least let someone else do the copy editing, if not letting someone else read the work in its entirety to make sure that it's sound. Your supervisor will of course be doing this, the supervisor will be doing this, but you do need to make sure that someone else perhaps reads your work before you let the supervisor see it. So as a supervisor, we shouldn't be expecting to see poor work. We should be seeing work, certainly towards the end of the process, that's almost perfect. So there's a lot to take in there, and really if we get this right, what we're helping the student to do is getting from being me to Dr. Me, or me with a master's degree or whatever. We need to acknowledge that on the way it's a very troubled path, a very windy road with lots of difficulties, lots of obstacles to be overcome. If these are approached properly, they can all be dealt with, and they should all be developmental for the student. The student should not only come out with a PhD or a master's or a dissertation, they should come away from your supervision process an improved person, possibly personally, but certainly professionally. So finally, that's my email. I know that Gmail is difficult for you in China, but there's also my WeChat, which you can scan and keep in contact with me. You're welcome to follow me on Twitter, but again, I know that's difficult in China. But my Twitter account is a personal account. It's not a professional account, but I am available there. And if you wanted to check my own research records, then I'm available on ORCID, and again there is a QR code that can be scanned there. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening. I hope that was helpful. Clearly I can't take questions immediately because this presentation has been recorded, but I'm very happy to take questions afterwards by whatever means, and it may be possible for me to come and meet with you live to do a session to talk about issues in supervision. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, I'm very pleased to be an academic dean in nursing at Southwest Medical University, and I sincerely hope that I will meet you all sometime soon. Thank you very much for listening.